Welcome into Trial Talk. My name is Ira Schoffel. I'll be hosting this conversation. I'm joined today by a really special guest, someone that I'm sure many of you, if you're watching this channel, if you follow true crime and that sort of content, certainly you're familiar with Dan Markel's story. I'm here with Dan's mother, Ruth Markel. Dan, of course, was a popular Florida State University professor who and lawyer who was tragically murdered now in 2014 in Tallahassee in broad daylight. And it was a story that really rocked our community in North Florida, where I live, but also over the last decade has just captivated, I think, the world because of all the intrigue and all the things that go along with the story. And Ruth Markel obviously has been in the middle of it, fighting for justice and fighting for advocacy, and just a big part of this process that continues to keep going. For again, if you haven't been following the case, 4 of the conspirators have been convicted or confessed or been convicted. There's another trial that's supposed to begin later this year, and there, maybe there'll be more down the road. But I just want to thank you first of all, for, Ruth Markel, for joining us, and I really appreciate you just taking some time.
Thank you so much. It's really my pleasure, and I hope the snow in Tallahassee has melted. I'm sure it might have. And at the same time, I'm sure you might have some listeners who are in California.
Yeah.
So I do want to just, send out my warmest best because it's really hard when you're surrounded by some kind of, trauma. And I think some of the things is the hardest thing is to really have hope when there's very difficult circumstances. So thank you for having me.
No, I think that's great. Great thing to point out. It's the world. Sometimes it feels like we're more distant than ever, and sometimes it feels like we're closer than ever. And obviously, yeah, all of our well wishes with the people in California who are still dealing with that. So I want to kind of go back a little bit, with your story, but then kind of where we are today, and some of the twists and turns and how it's impacted you and your family, and some of the work you guys have done, really for the community at large. Going back to the case, and again, somebody who lived in Tallahassee and worked out at Premier, where Danny was coming
Oh,
from,
really?
and all these everybody in this community I know has a story about how the Dan Markel case touched their lives. For early on, for so long, it seemed like there were no leads. I mean, I knew they put out the picture of the Prius, but nobody knew what that really meant and whether or not it would lead anywhere. And you think, oh, there's a million Priuses in the world, and then obviously, later on they make the connection. They, kind of needle in a haystack. They find the transponder, and everything kind of leads. The case kind of unravels. I was just curious if you could go back in that time period. How much information were you getting to victims and family members? Do you get updates? And what point did you feel like, okay, maybe there's actually something happening here?
Well, the earliest points are always the hardest for the victims and for anyone else because the Tallahassee Police Department, who might be looking very, very, searching very, very hard, if they might not be able to really communicate yet with the victims. So I think this is the part where, we start off at different points, the victims and the offenders. When the offenders come into any situation, they get their DNA taken, their photo, their fingerprints, and the victims are held, left really hanging with uncertainty and waiting. And I would say that is true for our first experience in the first years because of the fact that the Tallahassee Police Department had a big conference after year one. And they were very fortunate, later on through the cell towers, through all kinds of, data from the buses and so forth and security cameras, they did really track down and have the first arrest of Zigfredo Garcia in May 26, 2016. So we waited, and then all of a sudden, poof,
Yeah.
something happened, and so that was really the beginning of sort of the big part of the change of our own experiences as well.
Yeah, I think, and thankfully, I've not dealt with, the police or, legal, I've not been a victim of any major crimes. I've had some small things happen, burglaries, things like that. And even in those cases, I think there's a feeling sometimes of helplessness, and you wonder, are they really taking this seriously? And they can't tell you everything. If they give you all the information, then that could compromise the investigation. And I guess, what advice do you have for people that, because unfortunately, people that are watching this either have been or will be victims or have family members be victims of crimes? I mean, what would you tell people, or what do you tell people, when they're going through that uncertain phase?
Well, first of all, I'm going to share with you a statistic, which is 1 in 4 Americans actually have experienced some kind of crime, not necessarily violent crime.
Right.
And the ones that have had the violent crime, only about 10% have actually made the connection,
Wow.
through the system, with either not so much law enforcement, but when it comes to actually the state attorney's office
Right.
or the attorney general's. So it's a very rough ride for the victim. And that's one of the reasons that I'm speaking out, because I think that as much as we watch TV, which really shows us in a funny way what it's like, the first scene is meeting the victim in a police environment, or the family, really. It's the family at this point of the victim. And then afterwards, you see them in court. To some extent, that's really what it's like. We had to wait 5 years. The first 5 years were very hard because a lot of the victim services suddenly are thrown in just at the point of a trial. So you get a lot of support around the trial, around explanations of sentencing, the victim impact to do a victim impact statement, and at the same time afterwards, what does the sentencing look like, and so forth. But there's a lot of places where you're really hanging, and I call that like the uncertainty in waiting. And the lifestyle's like a roller coaster. It's up, it's down, it stays, and so forth. So that's the hardship.
Is there, I mean, philosophically, I mean, you're a, very smart person. You're an accomplished person. Before you were known as, the mother of a homicide victim, you had an established career as an author and career in management, and you're an accomplished person, and you've kind of helped people with how they run businesses. Can you, as you analyze the process, is there anything you would think that could be done differently? Because again, I think we all understand they don't want to compromise their investigation, but it's, the families a lot of times I think are in the wilderness.
I think there's a lot of places. In fact, I do some writing and different things, and you can make a flow chart really and show where there can be more interventions. In terms of the right for information, the right for some protection. At a certain point, we didn't need protection,
Right.
but there are other victims who do. One of the things I'm working on, obviously, talking about victim survivors, the homicide survivor is a very tough one because at the very beginning, it's an undefinable state. You actually are so numb, and I use that word numb, and it takes you a long time to really grasp what has happened to you because it's a sudden violent death. And that's even one of the reasons I actually wrote the book, The Unveiling, to open up what it looks like, the grief, because I didn't start grieving right away.
Right.
And that's so the point is the psychological, the sociological, and the physical impact of being a homicide survivor changes everything about you. Okay, and it's trauma. This is
Yeah.
not small trauma, and I think that's a really important point to acknowledge. So where can the system help you? There are opportunities for helping victims with advocacy organizations. There are mental health and PTSD services, and there also are, referring out the victim to other organizations. So these are places where, the victim can get that kind of support. But somehow in the time that you need it, the victim themselves is probably, I don't want to use the word hanging, it's not a good word.
Right.
The victim themselves is in such a state that they're not ready to really make all these arrangements for
Right.
themselves. So you need a better system.
And then how do you, again, the crimes I've dealt with were much minor, robberies, things like that. I experienced a little bit of rage after I felt victimized.
Right.
How did you? You always seem so. I've seen several of your interviews. You were such a gracious person. You seem like you are so composed, and I know it's been years, but how did you handle that part of it and kind of focus on all the things you've focused your attention to?
I think it's really important to know, and I want to go back because we are close to 11 years
Yeah.
in. The first 5 years was nothing like this. In fact, I see part of my, later advocacy role and different things is really finding, the meaning from grief. I was not this person the first 5 years, and I say this to everybody. I didn't have the anger that most, I think, people have, but I definitely had the numbness, the out of body experience, what I call disequilibrium. I'm a very big fan of something called crisis theory. And crisis theory says when you have a very hazardous situation or event that happened to you, you can either come out with three levels of equilibrium. One is higher, one is the same, and one is lower. And of course, mine was lower. Like I didn't have anything near the same level of coping as I had in my whole previous life. So that level of disequilibrium was really present, for quite a few years. And then on top of Danny's murder and the psychological and all the impact of starting to be a victim in the criminal system, like you have a lot of things that are hitting you at the same time. After about 2 years after Zigfredo Garcia was arrested, we weren't able to see our grandchildren, Danny's children. And that was really just like another, bang in the face, punch in the face. So, to put it in perspective, what you see today is not what was there the first 5 years. And I say this because all these families are suffering,
Right.
whether from school shootings, from the pandemic, and so forth. So it isn't glorious. It's not a great scene, even although we have glitz and glory with the media.
Yeah, I want to go. I was going to go in a different direction, but I want to go back to the advocacy. So, and you talked about, not being able to see your grandchildren, and the state of Florida passed the Markel Act in 2022, that you were kind of the driving force behind. Can you talk about that, and what, um, what you feel like that does for families in similar situations in the future?
I think the important point, just to talk leading from grief to advocacy, and then I'll go into the Markel Act.
Yeah,
The finding a root, finding some meaning from a very deep grief situation is very important. I started the advocacy not alone. There's a whole community. In fact, Karen Cyphers, I always give her credit,
yeah,
from Tallahassee, is the one who initiated a big community with the politicians, to pass a bill. I chose for myself the first route of my advocacy, which is the Grandparent Act, as really a necessity. I wouldn't say that I said, okay, although people told me outside of even meeting Karen in Tallahassee, you have to write a bill. But what I would say is that that was a necessity to try to do something. We had tried previous to have our lawyer talk to Wendy's lawyer. We went out on TV, Phil and I, and we talked on Dateline and, and 2020, and, nothing came of that. And then it really came down to getting a bill written. And so that was really a very keen opportunity for us that we found these phenomenal support and resources in Tallahassee who really orchestrated the initiative, along with some of the lobbyists and Danny's friends, Jason Solomon from Justice for Dan and Jeremy Cohn. These are all Jeremy's Tallahassee. They really carried the ball.
well, do you?
I mean, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt you.
I'll just tell you about the Markel Act. So,
Yes.
so that was passed in June of 2022. DeSantis signed the bill, and Governor DeSantis. And at that particular time, what it allows for is very, very limited scope, but it's very specific to people who have lost a spouse in any kind of criminal activity, and the living spouse, if they are charged criminally or civilly, then the grandparents have the right to visitation, but going through the court. But so it's a very big benefit now for anybody who has those there are particular, that's why I say it like that,
Right.
circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, that's, the whole situation. Again, when we talked about them, when I mentioned at the beginning in the introduction about this case, and I think why it's captivated so many people is because there's so many, I hate to even say fascinating or interesting because it's your real lives.
Yeah.
But it really it does because it's just, and I think people can put themselves in some of these situations. But the only, and again, not to bring my life into it, but I actually had a brother named Daniel that passed away in 2000, and my older brother, and
Right.
yeah, thank you. And my dad, he was never the same. I mean, he lived for another 14 years after Danny died, but he really was never the same. And I'm sure none of us are the same after something like that. I'm probably not either, but I can't even imagine him. And he was not a victim of a crime, but you know, devoting as much time as you and Phil and your family have into Daniel's life and justice for Daniel and all the things you're doing, because I would assume it's got to. I don't know if it's easier to kind of get away from it at some point or not, but you guys are immersed in it all the time. How do you get, how immersive is this for you, and just how much has it been, a huge part of your life since it happened?
For me, I would say we all handle it very differently. Like Shelley handles it more privately. Phil has other things he likes to do. I would say I am the one who's the most immersed in it, immersed, we're all immersed emotionally.
Right.
Let me clarify. Emotionally is everybody has been hurt, everybody's traumatized, and everybody's living with pain. And there's no taking away from any of that. Now is what do we do with the pain? All right, that's how it comes down to.
Right.
I have felt for myself, you know, for me, it's more like a rebound because I was a writer. I wrote the books before. I do the speaking. I think the book is a hard thing to do, to write a book about
Yep.
this, very hard, and so forth. But for me, I think the opportunity to speak again is probably part of my healing, which is unique from the others. It's like saying a doctor went back to work, an accountant went back to practice, a lawyer went back to practice after grieving. For me, this is probably what that is. I
Mhm.
consider it for me, the rebound. Now it's intense. I'm sitting in all of this conversations, you know, very often. Some people might say too often. I don't think so because I balance it out with all the other things with, my grandchildren, travel, a lot of friends. So it's not at the cost of anything else, but it's really at the point of a focus for me.
The when you the trials, I mean, there's been multiple trials now, that
Too
you've
many.
had.
Yeah,
And you've, are you gavel to gavel in Tallahassee for all of these? For people that don't realize, you and your family still live in Canada,
Canada.
and you come down for are you down? How much of these trials are
Yeah,
you down for?
we come for all the trials. We don't come for the hearings because those are many, but there's been, 4 or 5 big trials. There's another big trial coming up in June this year. That's the hard part too, because you see, trial life is not you say you talk about your dad, it's a really good example, and I'm sorry to hear about your family, and I'm sorry to hear that your father and most people are really still in pain. Loss of a child, you don't really repair that,
Yeah,
but it's just a situation where how we all cope with it and when we cope with it is what is, great grief is unique in that way.
right.
But having said that, the trial life is hard. The trial life is re-victimization. I'm not going to tell you that talking to people, writing the book, but coming back into a trial in a courtroom, you face the offenders again. You listen. Now, I'll tell you what I don't do, but the autopsies and medical examiner report, I can't stay in.
Yeah,
I actually, from the three of us, stay out. I can't, I don't want to see it or hear it really. So
right.
I probably miss the first 2 days, maybe half or something. And I'm not watching it. And I think I don't have a visual image, unfortunately, from Danny's uh, murder, other than they show the car all the time. But I don't. But I'm saying is at least I protecting them. There's some self protection for me by not watching or being present. But in general, listening to everybody, all the witnesses, and the tension of finding out, what's going to be the verdict, the deliberations. I mean, this is like if you want to have heart attack,
Yeah,
moments, these are the times, like in a each one was a different length of time, and it's you can hardly distract yourself even in those periods. You're so heightened up and so on.
The, yeah, I mean, I could bring you through it all again, but yeah, just going as you listening to you talk about it, I was thinking about watching these trials as just an observer, as just somebody who wants justice, for Danny. It's you're on the edge of your seat, so I can't even imagine, what y'all are going through. I did wanna go back to the media part, and you said this is probably more comfortable to you because this is a world you lived in before as a speaker and writer. Um, before most of my journalism now is in sports, but I used to be a editor of a newspaper in Maryland and a city editor in the news coverage. And when there was a tragedy, an accident or a death or any kind of tragedy, a lot of times we would ask the reporters, let's go to the scene and cover it. And there were young reporters. Most of my reporters were very young, just out of college, and they would never want to talk to the victims' families, which is I totally understand. But, what I would talk to them about was when my brother did die, he lived in a big city in South Florida, and it's almost like he died and there was never a mention of it anywhere, other than the death notice, just a 36-year-old guy died and nothing it's never mentioned anywhere, and I just said, some of these victims' families may wanna talk, even if it's not a murder investigation or maybe it's not, maybe they just wanna tell the story of their sibling or their child or the past, and if they don't want to talk, then that's perfectly fine. And, we don't want to intrude on their privacy. But I do think it's some people might want to tell stories. And I've found through my career that some people do want to talk through those tragedies. I was curious your perspective on has it changed at all? I know you've used the media somewhat as a tool, especially, during the investigation and for advocacy. But what was your perception of that going into it? And then I guess has it changed at all?
No, I actually did not use the media. It was very, we were quite private.
For a long time, right? Yes,
For a
yes.
long time, very long time actually, and but the public interest was huge. So let's, acknowledge Danny. Danny was known all over the world. There were memorials, in New York. There were memorials in California. There were memorials in Europe, in England, and in Israel, and so forth. So it was not a silent process for us at the
Right,
beginning, and we went when we went down to Tallahassee the first 5 days. All the media, so we're up in Toronto, went down my street because it was a big story. The American media and the Canadian, they knocked on all of our neighbors' doors at the time, and they didn't know him because he grew up in another area and he left it. Danny left, Toronto at 19 years old, so he was 41 when he was murdered. So nobody in the immediate environments of where we geographically lived at the time, or were, really knew him. So, but the American channels, as soon as we got back, asked us to come on, and this was everything. Later we went to date. They were out before us, ABC 2020 and Dateline and the others, and Inside Edition. I mean, they were doing their own thing
right,
way before we participated.
right.
We didn't really use the media, like the family using the media for about 2.5 years as a choice. We didn't, how that sometimes families go out and they tell the
Yeah.
public whatever about their circumstance. And even although it was a murder and a really well known murder at that point, we chose to be more private. It was later we went out.
Was it were you choosing to be private because you guys needed to just for your own health and well-being, or was it a conscious decision? Because I think some people would feel like, "Oh, we wanna be out there to help, spur people talking about it." What was there a decision or was it just that's
I
what
think
felt
I I think I wouldn't call it a real decision. I would, every family has whatever you would call them a style for that moment.
right,
I would say we wanted more privacy,
right,
and we were probably in shock to be honest. I think that, like the shock didn't make us come out if to the public on TV or anything. I think we were just like blown away, and we
right,
had so much to do. You see, our circumstances were different. Danny was a Canadian citizen, well, American too, but I mean, living in Tallahassee. We had to wait until we couldn't bring back the body because of the fact that the medical examiner had to release him. It was a criminal case from day one. So that in itself is really a problem. The Jewish religion actually normally requests you to have your funerals within 48 hours. So right away we didn't meet the religious criteria, and we had a lot of international maneuvering to do because you're bringing a dead body over to countries, right?
Right.
So this was like the complications. The first, like, so for I would say at least 2 weeks or 3 weeks, there was no way we were having any talks with the media, and
Yeah.
they did come. And in fact,
Right.
the media actually hid when Danny had the Canadian funeral, which was like 5 days later. They hid in there is media that took pictures
Oh,
because
wow.
that's what. So we were really not just really not ready.
Yeah, no, it's understandable. I hate to hear that, for sure. The During the legal process, were you, and again, you're obviously a very educated person, but did you know, and Daniel was an attorney. Did you know as much about criminal proceedings and the legal process beforehand, and how challenging has that been? And, just to understand for yourself, to educate yourself and your family to know what's coming up and how the process works.
First of all, I'll tell you, murder was never in my vocabulary, so
Mhm.
that can tell you not so much how the legal process works, but how your thinking goes.
Mhm.
So that would be the first part. There's two problems with the legal process. Remember, we're Canadian, so we're unfamiliar initially with what how the American criminal justice system works. There are
Right.
there are really differences along the way. I would say it's a learning curve. It's because there's terms that you have to learn. You have to learn, what is the in court expectation, what is sentencing like. We even had the death penalty, which is, I don't know if you know this, but Danny was one of the people who had the loudest voice against the death penalty.
Right.
So we had all these like, complicated conversations and circumstances to look at. I think the biggest learning curve in terms of understanding terms and different things and how it works is probably really getting on board as not a victim on a personal level, but really on a knowledge-based level, how to really go through the systems.
And so you mentioned you don't come down for the hearings, and so right now, Donna Adelson, who's the mother of Danny's ex-wife, is awaiting trial. They were actually supposed to have a trial a few months ago, then it was delayed. She had to change attorneys, and it's supposed to happen later this month. The
The
hearings do
hearings
have.
are before, the case management,
Right,
we're at every trial.
right, but the hearings have they have a big impact on what's going to happen at the trials, right? And so, are you watching them on Zoom, or are they
Yes,
getting
we
reports?
have multiple ways in which we're involved. Certain of the very big hearings, the judge has his own Zoom for the
Okay,
family. There's some moments where we use that facility, and then there's other ones that there's small hearings or case management. And then if not, we have opportunities like from several of the YouTubers,
hmm,
Court TV, the Tallahassee Democrat, WXTV, all of them and all in the I call them the podcasters, but that groups everybody
yeah.
together. They run their commentaries, and there's a lot of support in really getting the initial and the vibrant information, let's call it, from a hearing. And we can ask when it's active, when the case is active, and it is. We have opportunities to really get some clarifications and ask direct questions about something we might not have understood.
And do you, when you are in the trials, obviously, you can't be outwardly emotional, and you said you're seeing the people who are involved in the case, and you're hearing testimony, and you're probably hearing things that you don't believe are true, that people might be saying under oath at different times. How do you control your emotions? I know the judges are always very strict about what can be said and what can, how challenging is that?
Well, the challenge is certain witnesses, okay?
Yeah.
I mean, I can be explicit. The very first trial was the very first experience. When Garcia and Catherine McManua were being tried in 2019, and one of the witnesses, which was Luis Rivera, and that was like important because if he wasn't credible, a lot would fall down. So just to give you an example how that personalizes, I mean, I was really nervous. I'm not going to tell you no. And we had guests and family from out of town. I couldn't go out to dinner that night. Like I was pent up. So it does affect you. And there are also, like you say, certain people lie and they specifically that they're lying in their testimony, so that upsets you. I wouldn't say that that anything has come out like during the trial process. I can't think of
Yeah.
something specific that kind of shocked me or threw me off other than people distorting the reality as part of being a witness.
And then, I've been amazed with this trial, particularly, it's some of the witnesses who really didn't have any part of it, but are important. The neighbor who saw
It's
the
everything.
heard the shot, and the Professor Lacoste, and and I've been impressed by how, I guess, just passionate sometimes those people feel like they are in terms of wanting justice done too. Have you interacted with any of those people? Is that appropriate? And
Well, not with Jeff Lacasse or anybody. There's others maybe, but the neighbor is a major player here. Like if it
unbelievable.
wasn't for that neighbor, and we talk about it too. Like we're thankful to the Tallahassee community, which is a smaller kind of friendlier community in Toronto or in New York or any, nobody's going out of their house when they hear a gunshot, and and to go back again a second time. So actually, when he came, Mr. Geiger, I saw him in the court. I had sent him a thank you note, and on the very beginning, and I mean he's the break in the case, if not
100%.
him, and it just shows you what really a good citizen can do. I mean, and it's a hassle too. The poor guy's called back every, and there's so many trials. Like, so they want to live a normal life, right?
Right, right.
And
And
so it's hard.
yeah, even I just, and I know sure it's impossibly hard for you to listen to, the 911 call but just, you could just, I don't know, just he comes across to me as just such a good person, and just trying to do the right thing. And like you said, if I don't know if there's, yeah, if that break doesn't come, maybe nothing ever comes. But in Donna's case, Donna's trial, which is supposed to go forward, um, now there's I guess a motion to have it moved out of Tallahassee. Do you have any thoughts on that? Would it affect you guys much? Do you have a feeling, or do you just let it play out?
No, no, I think we have concerns. I think it should be in Tallahassee. I think the witnesses really should be comfortable, and then some of them are coming from live in
Right,
Tallahassee, and it would be very disruptive to them. They've already, put out. It's not even like it's the first trial. This is like,
right,
going to be something like it could be trial number 5 or whatever.
yeah,
This is not small difficulties in your life, and it is 10 years. It was now almost 11, like us. So you want to, if we want to forget it and we're traumatized, they're not traumatized, but they want to forget it more because they have choices in their life, so to request them. So you want we, or myself, I'll say, want the witnesses to be really at their best,
right,
and to be comfortable. And not everybody is familiar with the case. Even people do little tests here and there, and you ask a normal person on the street if he heard of the
yeah.
case, they might not even, although everyone in other places has heard about the case. So I think they'll get a jury, and I think that's the issue.
Of the trials that have happened, were there any ones that you were, again, like I'm like everybody else. I listen to, the mentor lawyer and the different podcasters and their viewpoints. It seemed like when Charlie's trial was over, after he had testified, and it's felt like Georgia Cappleman couldn't, a lot of the perception from the podcasters was that, Georgia never like got him to really trip up like you see on TV where, the attorney gets them to stumble and then they admit they did it, and how were you concerned? Were either of the trials, have you been like
No, I
more
think
worried than the others?
that particular trial, everybody knew he memorized,
Yeah,
he, played it, to, excuse me, the tune really well.
yeah.
And I think that at the end, Georgia did a great closing, and that's really what was important.
How impressed have you been by her and her co-counsel and just, I mean, I imagine you're cheering them on internally. Uh,
Sure. No, I believe the prosecutors have really done like a tremendous job. They're organized. The problem, as you might know, is the initial stages at the very we go
yeah,
back to 10 years ago, where there was the whole issue about the whole gang being arrested.
right.
And that was the big politics of the case. And once
Yeah.
that's not in place, I think they're doing a fabulous job.
I want to go back to that real quick, and we're about to wrap up, but because you mentioned that press conference earlier, so a year or so after the murder, the Tallahassee police had a press conference. It seemed clear that they thought they could press charges. The state attorney's office at the time didn't want to go forward, um, and so the case kind of languished there. Are you? Is there
No,
a
no,
way?
I'm going to
Is
give
it,
you a little
that was my
correction here.
that was my understanding. I'm sorry.
20, I'll go through it a little bit. So 2014 was the murder. 2015 was the first Tallahassee Police Department announcement about a car.
Okay.
Where we have to go one more year. It's a
Okay.
2016 when Garcia was arrested and in on May 26, 2016. And then afterwards,
Right.
on June the 2nd of that 2016, we're in 2016 now, the probable cause affidavit came out. And
Right.
that's when Donna, Adelson, and Charlie were scribed as unindicted co-conspirators. And it's from that time period that everybody wanted further arrests, or even at the time with Garcia, but it was 2016
Thank you.
was the landmark
No,
story.
yeah, that's helpful because I appreciate that. I'm sorry I messed it up. But yeah, that is that process is going on. There was a public fight kind of between public or private, I'm not sure, but between
Both.
the police and the state attorney's office. Is there anybody you all can talk to, or does it even matter? Your opinion doesn't matter, I guess, at that point, really. I mean,
No, you do try to talk because there were some opportunities of meetings and some of the early parts, but we're not yet in the process where, the real victim communications have started because this is early. This we're really talking, but there is certainly, a way in which you can sort of try to have people advocate for you, or you do some of it yourself through or yourself, your lawyers, whatever, friends. So there was definitely the idea of supporting, further arrests. Not the family was not leading the drive on that one in any way, but we were certainly once the names were named and so on. I mean, I think that would be really something that the supporting the Tallahassee Police Department, the FBI, and everybody else in the community and the media. I don't have to tell you, it was a frenzy if you're
right.
living in Tallahassee. And so that was really just, it was a disappointment.
So the book, The Unveiling, that you put out within the last couple of years, if you want to tell us, people that haven't read it yet, and I know a lot of people have, it's got great reviews on all the websites. If you want to share, a little bit more of kind of, the impetus behind it. And again, as a writer, I give you all the credit in the world for being able to finish a book, especially something so personal, because I know how hard that must have been.
That was a hard book to write. That was my 10th book and the hardest, of course, and the most intense because you're writing, certainly when you're feeling all the wounds and the book itself, the process of writing. So the book came out in 2022, and the reason I wrote it is called The Unveiling, a mother's reflection on murder, grief, and trial life. And there was two reasons I wrote it. One is that I wanted to give a voice to grief because there's so many people who are grieving. This was post the pandemic. It came out really after the pandemic. And every time, and I'm very sensitive to losses of children. So the school shootings that were happening, at that time were huge, when it just kept on rumbling, whether when it was Sandy Hook and then another And another time it was in another Parkland, Florida. And then so the school shootings is these are families that are suddenly victimized from murder. So I had a lot of purposes to write the book. And the other reason was to talk about the trial life, and particularly what it's like, because our story has, and I'm so supportive of the media and Justice for Dan, because we are really on a positive run with media, but it has so much glitz and glory to it, and so much of the true crime, really doesn't remember that there's family who are injured from a true crime story, like as the and this story, if you want to write, you're a writer. You can't even write a plot like this. You can't even create fiction like this. I mean, it just keeps on going. So, in the respect of that, it was very important for me to express what's behind the scenes, like lift the veil and see what's behind the scenes
Mm.
of the trial life, and that was the purpose, and it's still today because we're still going forward in all of this, and it's messy. It's if it was a process that sort of was orderly step by step, just in the last it's almost 9 months. I can't believe it soon. Where the next trial will be coming up, but we had a trial September 17th, a date with a jury ready to be selected, and the judge has to continue the trial because the lawyer has to resign, like the defense lawyer. I mean, where do you get this
Right.
trauma and drama, not trauma,
Yeah.
and things like that? So it is important to show that those processes, we're not just going along; we're victimized again.
Right. What is there a best and I know the book's available everywhere. You can be I'm sure all the booksellers, people is there a best place in terms of your perspective if people are looking to buy a copy of the book? Does it matter for you?
No, it doesn't matter. They can get it, it's all over the bookstores. In Canada, it was Indigo. In the States, it's Barnes and Noble, and of course, Amazon.
Right.
Amazon is always there, and they have it, the audio. It's an audio and digital,
Right.
and in a book form. So, there's plenty of opportunities, and I hope your listeners, I will get it.
I
It's
hope
an
so.
important informational piece. I think that's the purpose.
Hope so too. The last thing I wanted to ask you, because of the nature of criminal cases, and especially that are still ongoing. This is a case where you mentioned Luis Rivera. He confessed to his part in the killing. I don't think anybody else has really taken any responsibility. Would that matter if at some point anybody, the conspirators, anybody reaches out or takes accountability or apologizes or does that matter at all? Would that do anything? And I'm not trying to give them power, but would that matter to you? I don't know.
Well, on a legal level, it would be outstanding, really, if anybody plea bargained or admitted it, really openly that they were involved or how they were involved. I think anybody who was going to do it now is probably looking for, like you say, a deal.
Yeah.
What's the deal going to be? On a personal level, it is helpful because you know that there's enough guilt around, and at least there's an acknowledgement of something happened. It also would be good for my grandchildren. I'm watching this progress with a sad heart and a hopeful peace that they will start to they're 15 and 14 years old. I'm talking about my
Yeah.
American children. the
Right.
the Canadian grandchildren are much older and they know everything, and they're part of it. But for the others, I think it's very important that they have a record, that they have an understanding, and it's clear. It's not, said that it was a conspiracy against the family and different messaging, that they might be getting. So I think this is an opportunity if somebody does come out and explicitly say, even if they're looking for a deal,
Right.
whatever, plea bargaining or some other admission that helps them or move the process forward, I think that would be really, really very positive for all of us.
Well, Ruth, thanks so much for your time. I can't express it enough. Again, I've watched from the beginning of all this. I've paid attention to it and I've followed along, and obviously had sympathy for the family, but to watch what you've done over these last several years, in your advocacy and the way you handle yourself and your whole family. And I've seen, interviews with Phil and your daughter as well. And it's just remarkable. And so I just want to tell you how much we all think about you. And I know you've mentioned the community in Tallahassee, how much they've supported you all and what it means. And there's plenty more people that you've never heard from that I can tell you that have been impacted as well. And I really thank you for sharing some time with us today for sure.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank the Tallahassee community because you remember they really have been there, like,
Yeah.
not just for the people who knew Danny, but FSU and the synagogue where Danny, the memorials and the outpouring have been phenomenal. And the media also, like they're with us all the time at any of these trials or post the trials. So I do think it's Tallahassee has been very unfortunately,
Yeah.
bad for one part, but very supportive really on the other. And the community has been just great. And we're really very appreciative.
Okay. Well, hopefully these cases move on quickly as possible and total resolution and justice and we're certainly thinking about you guys. So thanks again, and we'll talk soon next time on Trial Talk.
Thank you and good luck in this project.
Thank you.